Hi, class. This is Dr. Trenton Hager, and today we're looking at a lesson based on the U.S. film Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. This is the film that's working with our chapter on the United States of America from the English-speaking world textbook. Due to scheduling, decided to send this out as a video lecture. There will be several occasions where I'll ask a question, and I'd like you to pause the video for a moment to kind of think about the question and reflect on how you would assimilate the information from the film into a potential short answer or long answer question on our final test. All right, so here we go. Looking at our movie, Three Billboards. Our goals for today is to see how we can link the information from the film to the chapter on the United States. We're going to look at a few themes in the film, as well as introduce the concept of an anti-hero and an anti-villain. And we're also going to look at the Southern Gothic genre and to see how Three Billboards qualifies as fitting within that genre. So I thought we could start with a character quiz. I'm going to show a few quotes from the movie and see if you can identify who the character is who stated this quote. Character 1. As long as you hold on to so much hate, then I don't think you're ever going to become what I know you want to become. Which character do you recall from the movie saying this? Character 2. You aren't trying to make me believe in reincarnation, are you? Because you're pretty, but you ain't her. She got killed. Still no arrest. How come, I wonder? Because there ain't no God and the whole world's empty and it doesn't matter what we do to each other? I hope not. I don't know what the police are doing. And then character 3 and 1 again. We've had 2 official complaints about those billboards. From who? There's your lady with a funny eye, a lady with a funny fucking eye, and a fat dentist. Jesus Christ. So if we look back at character 1, hopefully you've been able to identify this as Chief Willoughby, speaking to Officer Jason Dixon. Character 2 should obviously be our main character, Mildred Hayes. That leaves us with character 1 again being Chief Willoughby and character 3 being Officer Jason Dixon. So just thought we would do a little character quiz to kick off our presentation. Well, let's break down these characters a little bit more. When we look at the main character in the movie, we can see her name is Mildred Hayes, and the actress that plays her is Frances McDormand. In this movie, she's considered an anti-hero, which is similar to a hero that we normally see in movies, but she's going to have a distinct qualities about her that qualify her as an anti-hero. And we'll discuss this a little bit later. We can see her character is consumed with vengeance and anger, and we may often feel that this is justified based on what happened in the movie. We come to find out that she's a victim of domestic violence herself. We see that she is often politically incorrect, but that she is ultimately good. Looking at our next character, we can see Chief Willoughby, played by Woody Harrelson. We see that he is the chief or the main sheriff in town. We learn that he has cancer. Throughout the movie, we find out that he is actually a good cop, and he's very much a family man. And we have the question running throughout the movie, is he a good officer, and has he done enough? And whether we don't really know if this is the case, we're not presented with the full weight of the evidence, and maybe he has done all he can, but maybe there's also more that he could have done. We also see throughout the movie that he's quite funny and he has a bit of an ironic death. So you may want to take a quick pause and think about why his death would be deemed as ironic. Lastly, our third character, we have Officer Jason Dixon, played by Sam Rockwell, not Ram Rockwell. And we see he takes on multiple roles throughout the film. He's kind of the alcoholic, the joke, the village idiot in the movie, and he ultimately is categorized as something we call an anti-villain. And again, we'll discuss this in a little bit. We can see his character has some racist tendencies, and he practices police brutality. But we see a big change in this character, perhaps the biggest change of any character in the movie, to where at the end of the movie we may ask ourselves, does he do enough to redeem himself, or has he just begun that path? So we described several of the characters as not heroes or villains, but as anti-heroes or anti-villains. So I thought it appropriate to look a little bit more into what these labels mean. So in our movie, I've identified Mildred as the anti-hero and Officer Dixon as the anti-villain. But what exactly does that mean? Well, I thought we would use some more famous characters to kind of define that. So when we look at anti-heroes and anti-villains, we see that an anti-hero is the protagonist or our main, quote, good person, but they don't display the characteristics of a normal hero. So we normally see a hero associated with having a noble motivation or having a strong moral code, but an anti-hero still serves as the hero of a movie, but they may not display these characteristics. Whereas the anti-villain is the, quote, bad person in the movie, but they also don't portray the qualities we usually associate with a villain, which is pure evil or someone completely immoral or someone who has like a diabolical plan. In fact, oftentimes the anti-villain might eventually become a sympathetic character within the movie. So looking at some more popular depictions of anti-heroes and anti-villains, we see one of the biggest representations of anti-hero comes in the form of the Dark Knight in Batman, who ultimately is good and ultimately has noble motivations, but may go about things in an unethical manner. Looking at modern cinema, we could consider someone like Captain Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise as also an anti-hero. He's definitely the hero of the movie, but he's not what we normally expect of a hero. Considering our anti-villains, these are people that aren't exactly evil or immoral, and that we eventually have sympathy for. So Frankenstein is a common representation of an anti-villain. He's definitely the villain in the book, but he does exhibit some qualities of a hero, as you can see in this quote here. There is love in me like the likes of which you've never seen. There is rage in me, the likes of which you should never escape. And if I'm not satisfied in one, then I will indulge in the other. So it's this. It's capable of great love and capable of great hate. And if you don't give me love, then I will focus all of my energy on that hate. So he kind of serves as the anti-villain. Someone else from modern literature that we see from the Harry Potter series, Severus Snape, he kind of has the same aspects of an anti-villain. And then we do see characters that exhibit both qualities of anti-heroes and anti-villains. So in the television series Breaking Bad, we see Walter White, the father, husband, and teacher, starting off as the anti-hero. He's definitely the hero of the story, although he's not the average, normal kind of superhero we're used to seeing. And we can see him kind of devolve into the anti-villain. We know he's not essentially evil, but he definitely becomes a bad guy, a drug kingpin, a murderer, and this someone who cooks meth and sells drugs, which we obviously don't associate with a hero normally. So we do see sometimes a switch, a combination where the anti-hero eventually becomes the anti-villain. And this is a little bit represented in this movie by the character Jason Dixon, who starts out definitely as our anti-villain character, and we can see some progress where he may be becoming the anti-hero in the movie by the end of it. But we'll look a little bit more at this later. So in our movie, we're going to look at two characters who serve as the anti-hero and anti-villain. Looking at Mildred Hayes, she's definitely the protagonist in the movie. She's the identified good character in the movie for several reasons. She's defending her daughter. She's fighting for justice for what happened to her. She also is very vocal against the negative aspects shown in the movie, such as racism, violence against women. And we know by her actions, though, that she may not go about it in the normal way, that she is a good person. Looking a little bit more at her character, we see she qualifies as the anti-hero for several reasons. And you may want to take a quick pause and consider why she's the anti-hero before we continue. Considering her as the anti-hero, hopefully you looked at the fact that she sets the police station on fire, qualifies her as an anti-hero. We see quite often, Mildred as a bully. She bullies the priest from the quote we heard earlier. She bullies the teens kind of when they throw something at her car. She gets out and kicks them in the groin. This is definitely not typical hero behavior we normally see. She even bullies the police quite a bit through the advertising on the billboards, or even just her general actions and reactions with people kind of have a bullying tendency. And again, we don't normally associate bullying with the hero of the movie. We see a specific instance of this when she goes to the dentist and she takes the drill and puts it in his hand. You could argue that she was just offering self-defense, but did she really have to take it that far to drill through his hand? And then we see, even with the interaction with her own son, she's not always very nice to her son, and there could be several reasons for this. Just dealing with the grief, loss of her daughter. We're not really sure why. And then we also see the billboards themselves. She places the billboards up despite knowing that Chief Willoughby has cancer. Again, not an action we normally associate with the hero character. Well, looking at Jason Dixon, we can identify him as our antagonist because, he's violent. We hear about him having beat up several black citizens in town. So he obviously has this aspect of racism to him. And then we actually see him beating up Red, the advertising manager. So he definitely starts out as our bad guy in the film. When we look at how he qualifies as the anti-villain, this would be a good point for you to pause for a minute and kind of consider some of the actions or some of the words that he said throughout the movie and how that would qualify him as an anti-villain. Well, we can see he's the anti-villain. He's the bad guy because of what we just said in the slide before, but he does try to find the killer, so he does have this kind of redeeming quality about himself. He ends up apologizing to Red for his actions, which shows remorse, not typical of a villain. Villains don't normally show remorse for their actions. We even see that the death of Chief Willoughby is really has a real strong reaction with him, almost like Chief Willoughby was like the surrogate father, or served as a father figure for him. And so anyone who is grieving for another can't be all bad, which kind of shows that he's innately good. And referring back to he tries to find the killer, I mean, you have to remember he has this burnt face. And he goes and he picks a fight with the guy in the bar and just takes a brutal beating so that he can get some DNA to test for someone he thinks might be the killer. So these are not the actions of our typical bad guy. So this kind of qualifies him as our anti-villain who might be turning into our anti-hero. So with a better understanding of anti-heroes and anti-villains, a good question to ask is why were these characters used in the story? So why do anti-heroes and anti-villains make the story more interesting? And you should definitely pause here for a few minutes and kind of think to yourself, What makes them more interesting than the average good guy, bad guy? So hopefully you paused and gave this some consideration, because this is a good example of a question that could be turned into a long form answer on a test. Something like, by discussing the movie Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Miss Missouri, provide evidence that anti-heroes and villains make the story more interesting. So we look at what makes it more interesting is they're more realistic, right? Anti-heroes and anti-villains are more relatable because we know that humans are flawed. Um, and the idea of the perfect hero or the perfect villain we rarely see in real life. Um, the good guy who's always good and always does the right thing isn't really that interesting of a character, because you know what they're going to do. They're very predictable. They're a very boring character. And the same thing goes for the bad guy. You know what the bad guy's going to do. He's going to do the most evil thing possible, even if it doesn't benefit him, because he's just evil, so he has to do evil. Again, this is not very realistic. It makes the character quite predictable and therefore pretty boring. And so, another aspect of why these types of characters are more interesting is that we believe in the notion that everyone has a capacity for good and also has a capacity for evil. And it can be really difficult to separate these things. And a more realistic depiction of the real world is that we have a little bit of anti-hero and a little bit of anti-villain in us at different times, depending on our situations. So these characters make for a more interesting story because they're much more relatable than the 100% good guy or the 100% bad guy, which we just don't really see very often in real life. So moving on past the characters and into the story in general, Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri qualifies as under the genre called Southern Gothic. So we're going to look a little bit into the Southern Gothic genre, what that means, and see if you can relate how this movie fits within this category. The Southern Gothic genre has a long history in American literature. But for the purposes of this movie, Southern Gothic represents when grotesque situations or grotesque characters are presented. So we see this in what happened with Mildred's daughter. We also see it in the form of this unseen villain who rapes her daughter and then sets her on fire, which is just an almost unimaginable situation. This genre tends to take place in the American South, what's sometimes referred to as the good old country. And there's a lot of dark humor associated with this genre. Being part of the American South, we often see depictions of poverty, of crime, of violence, and race. And so a category like this presents a good potential test question. Identify how this movie exhibits poverty in the American South or exhibits violence in the American South. We can also see it in the form of the decay of the town. You can obviously tell there used to be some kind of industry there, but that doesn't exist anymore. And so now there's quite limited employment opportunities in the town. And the genre often examines the traditional values that are widely held in the American South. And it contrasts it with this. We have this idyllic vision of the South, but this genre obscures it by showing the historical realities of things related to, say, slavery or racism or patriarchy itself. So this genre kind of exposes the buried secret of the American South that we don't really like to talk about anymore. But there has been a lot of violence and a lot of racism and a lot of grotesque situations that have happened in the American South, and this genre explores that. And we also see in this type of movie what we call a non-American outcome. So we're kind of used to a lot of movies that portray the American hero. It's Superman, right? It's truth, justice, and the American way. But in this genre, you definitely don't get happy endings when with movies associated with Southern Gothic. So even in this one, we have the unresolved crime, and we have two of the characters going off to potentially murder someone who may or may not be guilty. So it's definitely not the happy ending we're used to seeing from Disney movies and our hero movies. When we look at the cinematography of these types of movies, we can see that darkness plays a really important role. The movie shows a lot of economic concerns, a lot of economic issues and poverty, presenting them in a more realistic setting than you might be used to. We often tend to see romantic views of nature and the South, and also the idea that things are not exactly as they seem. So if we move on to a larger question, it would be a good time to take a pause and consider this question. So I could have you make a list. Think about what's comprised within the Southern Gothic genre, and how is this film part of that genre? So again, hopefully you paused, and your list should include some aspects discussing racism in the film, violence in the film, um, the grotesque situations we discussed, the limited, seemingly limited economic opportunities, um, and then we do see an interesting contrast between, like we said, romantic views of nature. So Chief Willoughby has this perfect day with his family, and the perfect day is him with his wife and his children, and they're in this idyllic nature spot by a river with nature surrounding them, and it's beautiful. And then that day ends with Chief Willoughby putting a black bag over his head and committing suicide. So we can kind of see that contrast, that dark, those dark situations, that romantic view of nature, all rolled up in Chief Willoughby's last day. And then if we take the film as a whole, and we can say, we can ask this question: what aspects of modern American culture from the chapter can we see in this film? And I'm going to present you three different questions on the last three slides. And it'd be good to stop after each main question and kind of think, how would you answer this question if it were a test question? So what aspect does violence play in the film? You should definitely pause at least for a minute and kind of think, how would you answer this question? In general, what would you say about the role of violence in this film? And also, if you were asked to give some specific examples, what would you give? Hopefully, you discussed how sexual violence against women is a crucial aspect of the film. In fact, it's the impetus, it's the motivation for Mildred and everything she does in this movie is to get justice for her daughter. Um, it also introduces the idea of domestic violence against women. It doesn't go into it too much, but we do see depictions of this. And then a discussion of Mildred firebombing the police station, of Dixon throwing Red out of the window, or definitely more specific examples that could be discussed. A second and similar question could be, what aspect does race play in the film? So hit pause for just a minute and consider how you would answer in general, as well as with specific examples. Well, hopefully, you discussed Dixon is accused of beating up black people. We don't actually see this in the movie, but it's mentioned on several occasions. So we can see a kind of racist aspect there. And then there's another interesting example, which is when Mildred's friend at the souvenir shop is arrested for marijuana use and placed in jail as a way to kind of get at Mildred. And we can kind of see a racist stereotype here as, oh, well, she's got a friend who's black, so probably we can find out she's doing drugs and put her in jail. So we can see race plays a role in the film in a couple of different ways. And the final question to consider, what aspect does the Rust Belt play in the film? So this is a good opportunity to pause and maybe remind yourself, what is the Rust Belt? And then how is that represented in the movie? Because that would be also a fantastic test question. So remember, we talked about the Southern Gothic genre often depicts decay, post-industrial decay in America. Uh, and this really ties well with what's presented in the chapter regarding the Rust Belt, about how we used to have these large factories and industries, and then jobs were moved overseas for cheaper labor or cheaper resources. And we see these towns dying because they went from having a large employer to having very few employers. So that's a pretty good, that's represented pretty well in the movie. And of course, as a result, we see aspects of poverty, the dwindling white middle class. And I thought there were a couple of other situations that showed the situation with the Rust Belt, like limited, economic or employment opportunities. The visual of the abandoned highway, so they built a newer and better highway, and nobody uses this old highway anymore. And then especially think about the title and the three billboards themselves. Remember, at the beginning of the movie, they're just dilapidated, decaying, they're falling apart, nobody uses them, and she goes in and says she wants to advertise there, and they're just shocked. She's like, we have billboards over there. So that shows a really strong connection to the Rust Belt and the type of decay and loss of economy that we see in that Rust Belt part of the United States. So this has been a video lecture on the film Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. Hopefully, like I said, you paused throughout and considered some of the questions that we would normally discuss in class. Any questions that you guys have, or something that feel you need more information on, please contact me via email, or we can discuss it next time we do meet. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.